When it comes to supply chain software, often we use it out of necessity rather than because it's a truly great product. On top of this, many of the smaller, more agile players are now being aggressively acquired by some of the larger companies who often, after acquiring them, fail to innovate and improve. Today on LokadTV, we're going to discuss some of the root causes behind these worrying trends and understand what it is companies can do in order to react to them. So Johannes, why is it that we're sort of falling out of love with some of the products that we're sort of using in a supply chain context?
I believe, that the software industry has been driven a lot by passion. And it's very interesting because the amount of investment in terms of tech, of intelligence, of sheer innovation has been highly dependent on how many passionate people there were around to focus on those topics. For example, at one end of the spectrum, you've got gaming, where literally you had people who decided to dedicate their life to make great video games. And in terms of tech, I would say video games are incredibly state-of-the-art. I mean, they are marvels, and they were people who were absolute geniuses, who, like John Carmack, who were actually part of the team who built Doom, the first, probably one of the first super successful 3D first-player shooter. So it's very interesting. You have this sort of phenomenon that happens. Does it happen with supply chain software? A bit. I mean, I believe that I'm very, very interested in those topics. But let's face reality. There are very few people that I would say at the age of 8 years old says, well, when I'm grown up, I will be like an enterprise software developer. But you can have people like me who wanted just to do video games because that's very cool. So you have that. You can have people that have this early age passion. It happens in certain fields. It happens, I would say, much less in other fields. And so down the road, we end up after a couple of decades, of improvement in innovation, which is real. I would say it's still quite lagging behind, and I would probably qualify that there is hardly any product that would, among supply chain software, that would qualify as great. I mean, the sort of things that people are literally in love with. I mean, some people are in love with Instagram. They are in love with Facebook, they are in love with Gmail, so this is like the best product ever. I don't think, even if we have very happy clients at Lokad, I'm still not there yet, to have people that would say, I would not, live without that. I mean, we are not there yet. We are trying, but still there's still a long road until we have this degree of polish that is achieved in other areas.
Yeah, I think when I was growing up, I was definitely in that category of I wanted to be a professional sportsman and probably didn't think I'd end up in a supply chain kind of industry. So what's kind of the root causes behind some of these sort of worrying trends? What are we really seeing?
So, I mean, what we are seeing specifically in supply chain software is that supply chains are very complex systems and to some extent fragile ones. I mean, not fragile against everything, but in terms of software, they are relatively fragile. What do I mean by that? I mean that one bad ERP can literally completely mess an entire supply chain. And it regularly happens. I mean, last year, Lidl threw the towel after wasting €500 million on a failed ERP deployment where the intent was to deliver higher degree of optimization for the supply chain. So, I mean, it does happen. Target Canada actually cease to exist altogether. So those problems are very real, and the consequence can be literally very dramatic when this supply chain software fail. But because you want to kind of, by definition, you have to deal with a very complex system, and that you cannot really decide to do it locally. If we look at Target Canada, which is now defunct, I mean, they could not say, oh, we are going to be very well for one given store, because the problem is that it's a one network of stores to manage all together. You cannot say we are going to be very good locally, because then you create problems on the other stores. So as a consequence, I believe that the market has privileged relatively large vendors. And that kind of makes sense. I mean, first, if we go back a couple of decades in the past, it was very hard to have networked system. So it was very hard to have like a distributed software implementation for your supply chain. I mean, the rule, which is kind of still in place, is to have like a monolithic ERP or fairly monolithic systems where everything is brought to one place, as opposed to have, I would say, cloud-like vision, highly distributed, highly redundant, but highly dependent on high-speed internet connections that did not exist a couple of decades ago. So bottom line, we end up with market factors who kind of were driven first because of technology influence, high centralization because network computing was complicated, and but also favored by the fact that because you want to deal with large supply chain networks, it kind of, I would say, gives an incentive to companies and vendors alike to be large.
So what does the market actually look like then? Is it kind of made up of mostly larger players and there's a few sort of small players kind of kicking around? I mean, what does that do to kind of innovation and things like that?
I mean, Laura Cesare posted a very interesting post a couple of weeks ago where she was showing that the incredible numbers, I mean, in the range of the thousands. I believe, if I remember correctly, that it was above 2,000 acquisition in this field of enterprise supply chain software over the last 3 or 4 decades. And indeed, so it's a field that is completely dominated by large players like let's say SAP, Oracle, IBM. And it's not that there is no small players, but they are very routinely acquired by major players. And I would say there is, I would say, a relative scarcity and quite a scarcity of small players who just happen through success to become big. For example, 10 years ago, Facebook was still a fairly small company. So, they have grown from tiny to super giant. There is a lot of, in this BTC segment, there is a lot of companies who went from very small to very large. And if we look at many of the best apps on the internet nowadays, many of those apps did not exist 10 years ago. So it's interesting. It's like there is a constant stream of companies who manage to grow from very small to very large and maybe enter a plateau and potentially decay, which has happened to Yahoo, for example. But it's interesting this process happening in supply chain enterprise software, much less so. I mean, the companies tend to grow a little bit, and when they reach something like 100-200 employees, they just get acquired by very large companies, and then innovation stall.
Okay, and what's different about the approach that sort of that larger company would take compared to a much smaller company that's growing quite rapidly?
I mean, it's very difficult to be both very large and very innovative, especially when the innovation fundamentally is at odds with your core business model. I mean, even the most incredibly profitable, super well-managed companies like, for example, Microsoft, which has been one of the most profitable companies of all time, it took them literally 2 decades to wrap their head around open source, which they are now embracing fully. So they went from open source is a cancer of our industry to we completely embrace open source. It took them 2 decades, and it was because it was like a fantastic companies with literally tons of exceedingly smart people, incredible managers. I mean, they had and with tons of cash and literally decades to execute that. And they manage, but you see that gives the magnitude of the challenge when you want to wrap you wrap your business around a new concept that just represents a paradigm shift for your business. So what is, for example, one of those problems for enterprise supply chain softwares? They all more or less they all emerge, all those leaders in the late 70s or early 80s. With one key innovation at the time, which was relational database. That was really the key for Oracle that gave birth to the Oracle database, which is still, a company exceedingly attached to its flagship product. But really SAP and GDA and many other companies were really kind of product of their time, were being very close to those relational database. And it profoundly shaped their software for good things and bad things. I mean, it gives tremendous results as far inventory management is concerned, about having very high integrity of the records that you keep. All of that were tremendous achievement. But at the same time, they did end up kind of locked in a specific way to think the supply chain and think the software that they have to operate the supply chain. And so it's interesting because I see that when they acquire, when those companies acquire, I would say, other companies that were not really, built around the paradigm that the relational database is the alpha and the omega of the software, of the supply chain software. Usually, and still nowadays, those companies, once acquired, kind of fail to manage to pivot the culture of the mother company, which is something like 100 times larger than the company being acquired. So the dominant culture remains whatever was the dominant culture.
So I think
before.
you mentioned quite a key word there is culture. So what is so bad about the culture in some of these larger companies, and why is it so difficult to change?
I mean, first, it's because it was a game where the market was really demanding like large vendors. The market did end up with large vendors, and those large vendors have been playing a very aggressive, strategy of M&A. I mean, if you look at GDA has been acquiring tons of companies, Oracle has been acquiring tons of companies. It's quite different from, let's say, companies like, let's say, Google or Apple, who deliver, very, very good products. But it's mostly not acquisition. I mean, it's mostly something that is emerging organically from the company. And the problem is that you end up with, it's very hard to have, an M&A strategy, a growth through acquisition that end up producing great products. Because the problem is that it requires super sharp focus, a vision, and to some extent, when you do that, you kind of polarize the market. It's very intriguing. When Apple started to push the iPhone 1, nowadays people would say, "Oh, obviously they did the right thing," and literally every single smartphone now is something that is like pretty much the descendant of the iPhone in terms of form factor and features and whatnot. But when they pushed that, there were a lot of people who were saying. Dude, do you really want to watch TV on your phone? I mean, does that make any sense? And you know what? If you want to read the time, you can also read the time on your watch. Turned out that you see this, and that's what happens with truly great products, is that they are only great in retrospect. At first they kind of I would say enter a stage of conflict with the habits and what was perceived as the dominant pattern before. And in the specific case of supply chain, because it's social constructs, it's more difficult to permeate sorts of markets.
So obviously the iPhone's an example of a really truly great product. So what are some of the pitfalls that you can kind of encounter when you're trying to create this truly great product? What are the problems that you come across?
I mean, first, to some extent, you have to go counter, the intuition of, the saying that you need to listen to your customers. When you're in enterprise software, you have to listen to your customers. And most of the time, they are absolutely correct. That when they say my business requires this and that, usually it's not it's not just to annoy the enterprise software vendor that clients are saying that. It's because they have demanding requirements, and those requirements are real. But in a way, the problem is that if you stick too closely to those requirements, it's hard to see what will come next. If, as Henry Ford was saying, quoting Henry Ford, they say, if I had listened to my early customers, I would have tried to figure out how to make faster horses. And it turned out that faster horses was not the way to go. It was automotives, but that was, you had to wrap your head around the problem and stop listening to some point to your clients. which is very difficult for enterprise software, because if you don't listen, you lose your client. It's very, very painful. And if you do listen, even if that does not work, the worst part is that you still get paid. So I mean, that's a very perverse incentive. If you listen to the client, you get paid, even if it doesn't work. If you don't listen, you might get paid ultimately by another client. Because obviously if you start by saying no to a client, this one company is not going to become your client, but maybe another company who will show interest and recognize the value in your innovation, but that's a much more risky move. So that also really complicates. And then I believe that because supply chain software is very complex, too frequently vendors were putting too many cooks. You have this model of too many cooks spoils the brush. And when it comes to great software products, it's very hard to have a great software products if you have like hundreds of software engineers. It might come as a surprise, but if you look at, for example, what Google is doing for search, it's actually a very close team of just a few dozen of people who are, tweaking the core search algorithms. And it makes sense because ultimately, when you type some keywords in Google, you can only have, one set of results. So it's on one option.
So how can these companies then completely reinvent themselves? Are you saying they should not listen to their customer at all? They should get rid of half of their engineers? I mean, it all sounds very counterintuitive.
So I would say, first, you don't have to, have companies that reinvent themselves. For example, Yahoo failed to reinvent themselves. Well, Google ate their lunch, and this is it. So my take is I'm not overly optimistic in the fact that companies that have been stuck for multiple decades in a paradigm will ultimately evolve. But the good news is that if you happen to be a company running a supply chain, you don't need to reinvent yourself. You just have to pick a different vendor, which is a much easier task. So question is, yes, you can take this one vendor and expect that they will reinvent themselves, or you have an easier solution, which is to go and take another vendor, which doesn't require you to reinvent yourself, which is much less dramatic. And then the market Darwinism will just, sort it out.
So what can that smaller company do in order to kind of break the mold? As it grows, it suddenly becomes more successful. How can it stay kind of reflexive, and how can it stay successful?
I mean, so that the question is maybe a question, for a company like Lokad. So one answer is not being acquired, which is frankly difficult because if you face some degree of success, again, growing a company in the world of enterprise software is slow. In Lokad, we have been around for a decade, and we have been growing very, very nicely and very successfully, but still we are nowhere near as large as, let's say, an Oracle of this world. And it will probably take decades if we ever manage to do that, which will be fantastic. But let's say, most incredible case, which has like one chance out of 1,000, it will still take decades. So the bottom line is that obviously for those small companies, the message would be not to get acquired, but frankly, it's hard to blame, I would say, a founding team who spent 15 years growing a company successfully to, let's say, 200 employees, which is quite an achievement, in this sort of field. And to blame them for selling, their company to GDO, Oracle, SAP, right? They earned it, so difficult. So I believe that the solution is not exactly in this area. It will be more on the client side, which is, I believe that one of the key solutions is to have an approach that is more like to stay clear from requirements where you want, I would say, a solution that does everything. Because if you come, to as supply chain manager, supply chain executive, if you say, well, as first requirement, I want a solution that does everything, then by the way, then you end up with SAP, IBM, Oracle, and a tiny few, there is half a dozen of companies worldwide that can claim to be able to do all of that. So then you're stuck with those folks because you've implicitly made the decision to use one of those companies. So the starting point is to say, okay, how can I think about a problem where I will figure out one problem and find an app for that, or find something that has a much tighter scope and say I want to be like the best of breed for this specific problem. And the good news is that thanks to the internet, it's now, I would say, orders of magnitude easier to have an applicative landscape that is made of many apps. Having many apps is not a problem as long as apps are, I would say, have tightly defined boundaries.
Okay, and sort of start concluding and bringing everything sort of together today. Can you sort of see a day when these sort of toxic patterns are kind of leaving the supply chain industry, or is it very much an industry that's kind of set in its ways and there's no way we'll ever get to the stage of the gaming industry or something a little bit more glamorous?
I think it's an interesting question. I believe that the answer is kind of exceeds the strict scope of supply chain. There is, I would say, an underappreciated value to the negative knowledge. It's very funny because it's something that is completely not specific to supply chain. Science in general, biology, medicine, even physics, etc., is still struggling to come to terms with this idea. So what is negative knowledge is to know stuff that do not work. There are basically success is never guaranteed, but failure can be. And in a way, failure modes can be things that are exceedingly predictable and literally guaranteed. And it's very interesting because in this days and age of innovation, etc., it's hard to pay attention to the fact that even if tech is always changing and you have always new ways to improve, etc., you have an ever-growing, potential knowledge, not necessarily actual knowledge, but potential knowledge of negative knowledge, which is all the things that have been tried and tested and deemed as recipes for failure. And it's very interesting because this knowledge is very valuable because it's stable. It doesn't change. It can be incredibly predictive. And it's saying, you see, I say, do this and you will succeed. 5% chance maybe. But do that and you will fail, and that you can have like 100% guarantee that will be a recipe for failure. So it's not just in supply chain. Again, that's coping with negative failure because negative knowledge, and we value and reward things that are about the positive knowledge. The Nobel Prize winners, the people who say we managed to find a new way to do that, and it's a tremendous achievement, and it is. But we don't have, I would say, the jewel of the Nobel Prize, which would be people who spend their life to collect and consolidate all the ways that you can tackle problems and that actually will lead to failure. So I believe probably the path forward for many companies tackling complex supply chain problems is to start to have a culture where failures is not celebrated. You want to celebrate, success, but failures is respected and documented and analyzed, even if it represents some kind of, even if it's a fairly painful exercise.
Okay, maybe we'll start seeing a negative Nobel Prize sometime soon.
Yes, maybe.
Okay, that's everything for this week. Thanks very much for tuning in, and we'll see you again next time. Thanks for watching.